Harris spots a swarm of undercover agents and runs.
Stop right here!
A deputy tackles Harris. That's when 73-year-old reserve deputy Robert Bates shouts that he'll use his taser.
Now!
But the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office says Bates instead grabbed his gun and pulled the trigger.
I'm sorry. Stop it! He's not.
Our guest is a retired New York City detective sergeant, an adjunct professor at John Jay College in the city, also author of The Criminal Investigative Function. Let's welcome Joe Giacalone back to MidPoint. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about this first of all from what we have just seen. If an officer is trained properly, an officer, any kind, would you believe that it is even possible for an officer to mistake a gun and a taser
this
unit?
is something where you can't dispute the difference.
I think we might have lost Joe. Okay, we did lose Joe. We're going to get him back because apparently we're having a problem with the transmission. Stand by just a moment because that is a key question here. Because let's begin with that. The fact that the officer involved, whether he's a volunteer or not, doesn't make any difference. One of the biggest things that most cops that I've spoken to have talked to me about and have shaken their head at is that they would say it is, and these are experienced officers, they say it is impossible for a trained officer at any time to reach down, grab for a weapon, and mistake a taser weapon for your weapon, for your service weapon. Simply put, there is much too much difference between the two. So then how do you do it? How do you even get close to that? Many say, and I've had some cops tell me personally, that what they do is they'll place the taser on their left if they're right-handed. They'll put the taser on their left so that they have it there. They know exactly that's what's there on their belt. They'll take their service weapon and they'll place it on their right, other ways around if they are indeed left-handed. That stops them. Joe, you're back now. Let me get right back to the question. And before we get to what's happening in Tulsa right now and what their newspaper there reported about this volunteer cop, would you even think it inconceivable that a trained veteran cop could in any way, shape, or form mistake a taser for a service weapon?
No, they're different shaped, even though you can almost, the new tasers are shaped like firearms, but the weight, everything that's included into it, I can't see that mistake being made.
Okay, then let's go from there. Now we have a report in the Tulsa World newspaper today that they're finding supervisors at the sheriff's office were told to forge Robert Bates' training records. 3 who refused were reassigned to less desirable duties, and apparently the newspaper says after this shooting happened, they were hearing almost immediately from sources that the records had been falsified. Isn't this just, if that's true, then we have to look at the possibility that this was nothing more than a guy who wanted to be a cop and basically was sold a badge by the sheriff who's involved. According to the Tulsa World, the sheriff's office provided a list of the courses that Bates received credit for. By the way, we've had another problem with Joe. We dropped him for a moment. We're going to get him back. Hang tight. They're saying that a list of the courses Bates received credit for was provided by the sheriff's office, but did not give details such as the names of the supervisors who signed off on the training. Now, the reporters who were involved, they have been asking. They said, okay, look, give us the names of the supervisors who've been involved. However, what's happened is the sheriff's department has not gotten back to them with the names of these supervisors. So they're still left with a question here as to who these people were. The orders, though, and this is another key facet to this story, because many people are saying, all right, well, you did this after it happened. No. According to the story in the Tulsa World, the orders to forge the training records and then to change a lot of the solutions there, a lot of what was found, started years before this shooting happened. This was when Bates was trying to get on as a deputy. So what we have here, and we're going to get him back after the break here because I want Joe to, because he's the guy who's been there. He knows a lot about this, and this talks to the trust of law enforcement. How then is a sheriff's department supposed to then have the trust of the people involved? And let's face it, this is not Ferguson, this is not Staten Island, this is not Cleveland. This is an entirely different situation. But how are you supposed to have trust? Put yourself in this position. You live in the community. You live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You know that a cop is 10 years past the mandatory retirement age. Now, volunteers don't have, there's no mandatory retirement for volunteers. But you've got a cop that's 10 years past the age of retirement in Tulsa, 63. A volunteer who had 1 year as a cop in the 60s, who has been allowed to carry a badge, a taser, and a gun, and turns out that he didn't get the training that he was supposed to get. How secure does that make you feel as a member of society? Not only that, how does it make you feel as someone who needs to put complete trust in law enforcement? Joe Giacalone is going to come back and join us after that, because we'll touch on that issue and more when we continue right here on MidPoint. All right, welcome back to MidPoint. We have our technical issues resolved now, and by phone, here's adjunct professor at John Jay College in New York, also retired NYPD Detective Sergeant Joe Giacalone. Joe, sorry about the technical issues here.
No problem.
But let's go ahead and roll on a few things here, because we already talked about, and I gave people a lot of the background as to what's happening here in Tulsa. But this Tulsa newspaper report that the records, the training records of this volunteer were allegedly altered, they were forged. This is a volunteer. What does this say to you, though, as a veteran cop and somebody who put in a lot of training time, and you've got basically someone walking around, and it's being covered up by the sheriff's department? This is a frightening idea of why people do not trust law enforcement.
Yeah, this is a real disaster in the making. I mean, it's bad enough that he makes this mistake about having the taser in his shooting hand. I mean, the taser's preparing a non-shooting site to avoid such a problem, just like what happened. So that's to me is already an issue. The other issue that you have to deal with here is that these falsifying records. I mean, I don't know who's trying to cover up what, but this does not forebode well for not only the police department in Tulsa, but for all law enforcement, because people who are anti-cop right now is pointing to this incident and saying, "See, look what they do. When they do something wrong, they try to cover it up."
Joe, but can't we say that this is happening a lot in the country? And let me just back this up by saying, as a kid, I happen to know that there were people there were fathers, there were people involved in law enforcement, and a lot of times there were volunteers who did exactly the same thing. They gave a lot of money to campaigns, they threw in for cars, and they were given badges and guns. You can't do that anymore, but this does happen in a lot of places around the country, doesn't it?
Well, sure it does, because of the fact that jurisdictions find it an easy way to avoid hiring police officers, and it saves them money not only in salaries but in pensions and health benefits.
But isn't it also favors, though, Joe? Because this sheriff and this guy had known each other for a long, long time. This sounds like it's an old buddy of his, and basically he wants to play cop.
Right. I mean, listen, anybody who pays money and then wants to be, to go out on patrol, whatever, is already suspect as far as I'm concerned. This is not a game. This is real life situations. This is not TV. This is something where, I mean, the age is a factor as far as I'm concerned too. I mean, even New York City Police Department, you have to be out before your 63rd birthday. 73 years old, out on patrol on a fugitive task force, to me is just mind-boggling.
We got to back up just a little bit here. Let's not throw every single volunteer under the bus around the country, because there may be 500,000 volunteers out there right now, the statistics kind of vary, who are working in police departments. They do valuable things. They're good cops. They're good volunteer cops. They help. But how do we then say, look, we don't have the budget, is what a lot of places will say, so we have to have them. So, Joe, what's the best idea here to reconcile this? Because, as you said, now people are going to be going after law enforcement now, saying, you can't have these people sitting there. They're not real cops.
Yes, no, I mean, this is something where they have to make sure that they've all been trained the same way a police officer would be if they were hiring as a full-time position. The training records for firearms and for tasers and everything else that goes through it. I mean, there's got to be some sort of state qualification. There has to be some sort of formal education for these guys that and girls that do this. I mean, it's great that they want to help serve their communities and they want to volunteer. This is a different situation than being a volunteer fireman. I mean, this is something where danger lurks at every corner, and this is something that it shouldn't be taken lightly.
Joe, what about taking these volunteers and putting them in non-violent, non-lethal situations so that the cops, the trained cops, can go out there and actually take care of real crime?
Well, sure. I mean, but it seems as if these men and women are being used as backfill for a lot of the different patrol responsibilities out there. And I think this incident's going to cause a big focus on what police departments are doing with their volunteers and how they're being used. And unfortunately, a bad incident like this is going to cause a backlash to all those men and women that volunteer their time to help out their communities.
Isn't this also going to force many police departments then to basically justify how many cops they have? Because people will say, well, you can't afford them, maybe you don't need as many cops. But on the other side, crime doesn't take a day off simply because you have too few cops.
No, crime never takes a day off. I mean, now we're going into the summer months too, which we usually see a rise in the crime too. You have to examine what the hiring practices are, what these departments and what these jurisdictions are doing in order to, are they doing it because they want to save money, or are they doing it because they really don't have the money? I mean, this is something that needs to be examined at the administrative level with the mayor's offices and the town supervisors who are doing these things.
Joe, can people still trust their cops?
I hope they do. I know, but hope is not a plan. I mean, I've seen a couple of incidences recently that, as a pro-cop advocate myself, it really disheartens me because, I worked hard, and a lot of other men and women work hard in this profession, and unfortunately, all it takes is one incident for everybody in the public to turn against you, and it takes years to build that trust back up. And we're going to have a long way to go in order to build that trust and build that relationship back up with the public.
And the sheriff in Tulsa, Oklahoma has a lot to answer for right now because he's the guy who put the gun in this gentleman's hand. A reminder once again that the book is called The Criminal Investigative Function, a guide for new investigators. Joe Giacalone, thanks so much for joining us. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you. You too.
All right, take care. The minimum wage debate. How little is too little? It's sure to be a major issue in the 2016 presidential campaigns. We've got it here, and it's happening right now when MidPoint continues.